The molecule that bent the 20th century, a story of accidental revelation, cultural revolution, and chemical mysticism. Part 1. The accident in Basel. The story begins not with a guru or a rock festival, but with a meticulous Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann, hunched over a laboratory bench at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Basel, Switzerland in 1938. Hofmann was working his way through derivatives of ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain, infamous for centuries of causing mass hallucinations and convulsions in European villages when it accidentally contaminated bread supplies. The affliction was called Saint Anthony's Fire, and medieval chronicles are filled with its horrors. Peasants writhing, seeing demons, their limbs blackening with gangrene. Nobody knew why. The answer, it turned out, was hiding in the fungus all along. Hofmann was synthesizing compounds derived from lysergic acid, a core component of ergot alkaloids, hoping to find something useful for cardiovascular or respiratory medicine. On his 25th attempt, he created a compound he labeled LSD-25. The full chemical name was Lysergsäure-diethylamide in German, lysergic acid diethylamide in English. He noted it seemed to cause restlessness in lab animals, found it unremarkable, and shelved it. For 5 years, LSD-25 sat in a drawer. Then, on April 16, 1943, something unusual happened. While resynthesizing the compound, Hofmann accidentally absorbed a tiny amount through his fingertips. He suddenly felt dizzy and restless and was forced to leave work early. At home, he lay down and experienced something he would describe as a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition, featuring an extremely stimulated imagination and an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. It lasted about 2 hours and then vanished, leaving him refreshed and clear-headed. Hofmann was a careful scientist. He knew something extraordinary had just happened, and he needed to replicate it deliberately. Part 2. The bicycle ride that changed everything. 3 days later, on April 19, 1943, a date now celebrated in psychedelic culture as Bicycle Day, Hofmann intentionally ingested 250 micrograms of LSD-25, dissolved in water. He had calculated this as a threshold dose, not knowing that LSD was so extraordinarily potent that even 25 micrograms is pharmacologically active. He had just swallowed roughly 10 times a strong dose. 40 minutes later, the world began to dissolve. He wrote in his lab notes, beginning dizziness, feeling of anxiety, visual distortions, symptoms of paralysis, desire to laugh. Unable to drive in wartime Switzerland, Hofmann asked his laboratory assistant to escort him home by bicycle. This is where the story takes on an almost mythological quality. Here was one of the most profound chemical experiences in human history unfolding on a push bike along a Swiss country road. Hofmann later recalled that despite pedaling furiously, he felt for a terrifying stretch like he was standing completely still. Time itself had become elastic. By the time he arrived home, the experience had become overwhelming. He believed he was losing his mind. He thought he was dying. His neighbor, summoned for help, appeared to him wearing a lurid mask. A doctor was called and found, to his bewilderment, that Hofmann's vital signs were nearly perfectly normal. The terror slowly alchemized into something else entirely. Wonder. Little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes, Hofmann wrote. Fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and closing themselves in circles and spirals. The next morning, he felt fine, better than fine, reborn. Hofmann spent the rest of his long life. He died in 2008 at age 102, calling LSD his problem child, but also his greatest discovery. He believed until his last breath that it had been placed in his hands for a reason, that the molecule itself had wanted to be found. Part 3. The molecule itself. Before we ride the cultural wave that followed, it's worth pausing on the chemistry, because it is, in its own right, astonishing. LSD belongs to a class of compounds called ergolines, and more broadly, to the tryptamine family of psychedelics, sharing structural kinship with serotonin, your brain's own master mood regulator. Its chemical formula is C2H25N30, and it is among the most potent psychoactive substances ever discovered. An active dose is measured in micrograms, millionths of a gram. A single gram of pure LSD could, in theory, produce 10,000 individual doses. LSD is almost certainly the most efficient psychoactive molecule known to science. Its mechanism of action is fiendishly elegant. The molecule is structurally similar enough to serotonin that it binds to and activates serotonin receptors, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor, throughout the brain. But unlike serotonin, it binds with extraordinary persistence. Modern neuroimaging research has revealed one reason the experience lasts so long, often 8 to 12 hours. The LSD molecule essentially gets trapped inside the receptor, which closes a protein lid over it, locking it in place. Your own receptor becomes a cage for the molecule. In brain imaging studies, LSD produces a dramatic increase in global connectivity. Brain regions that normally maintain polite professional distances from each other suddenly begin communicating in a frenzy. The visual cortex begins talking to areas responsible for emotion and memory. The default mode network, associated with your sense of self and ego, begins to fragment and dissolve. This is the neurological basis for what users describe as ego dissolution, the terrifying transcendent feeling that the boundary between self and world has evaporated. The molecule weighs almost nothing. It rearranges everything. Part 4. The government gets interested. Sandoz Pharmaceuticals began distributing LSD to researchers worldwide in 1947 under the trade name Delicid, marketing it as a tool for psychotherapy and as a way for psychiatrists to briefly simulate a psychotic state and thereby better understand their patients. Predictably, almost immediately, the CIA got involved. In the early 1950s, the agency launched MKUltra, a sprawling covert program testing LSD and other mind-altering substances on unwitting subjects, including mental patients, prisoners, and even their own agents, in hopes of developing a truth serum or mind control technique. The experiments were often horrifying. One CIA operative, Frank Olson, was secretly dosed at a retreat in 1953. 9 days later, he fell from a 10th floor New York hotel window. His death was ruled a suicide. The full story of MKUltra wasn't publicly known until the Church Committee hearings in 1975 revealed that the CIA had destroyed most of its files. The government was looking at LSD as a weapon. Others were about to discover it as a sacrament. Part 5. Harvard catches fire. Enter Timothy Leary, charming, brilliant, reckless, and constitutionally incapable of doing anything quietly. In 1960, Leary was a clinical psychologist and lecturer at Harvard University, well-published and professionally established, but privately restless and hungering for something he couldn't name. That summer, vacationing in Cuernavaca, Mexico, a colleague introduced him to psilocybin mushrooms, and the experience, he would later say, taught him more about the mind in 4 hours than the preceding 15 years of academic psychology. He returned to Harvard transformed. Together with colleague Richard Alpert, young, Harvard-trained, from a wealthy Boston family, equally brilliant and considerably more elegant in manner, Leary established the Harvard Psilocybin Project. They began studying psilocybin's effects on graduate students, prison inmates, and divinity students in the famous Marsh Chapel experiment of 1962, where theology students given psilocybin overwhelmingly reported profound mystical experiences. Their research was unconventional, enthusiastic, and growing increasingly difficult to distinguish from advocacy. Then, in 1962, Leary tried LSD for the first time. If psilocybin had been a revelation, LSD was a detonation. Leary became consumed by it. The research operation shifted. LSD became the center of gravity. Alpert was equally captivated. They began using the substances themselves, repeatedly, enthusiastically, which violated every standard of clinical research. Colleagues grew alarmed. The Harvard administration grew alarmed. In 1963, both Leary and Alpert were dismissed from Harvard. Leary for failing to show up to teach his classes, Alpert for giving psilocybin to an undergraduate. It was the most consequential firing in the history of American academia. Unmoored from Harvard, Leary became something else entirely, a prophet. He relocated to a sprawling estate in Millbrook, New York, the Hitchcock estate, funded by millionaire sympathizers, and turned it into a commune and laboratory of consciousness. Here, Leary refined his gospel. He developed a vocabulary for the psychedelic experience drawn from Hindu philosophy, Tibetan Buddhism, and quantum physics, blended with his own theatrical flair. He began writing and speaking prolifically. He coined the phrase that would define and damn him simultaneously: turn on, tune in, drop out. America heard it as an instruction manual for chaos. Part 6. The Merry Pranksters and the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. While Leary was holding court at Millbrook, a parallel psychedelic revolution was igniting 3,000 miles away on the West Coast, with a very different aesthetic. Less Sanskrit, more streaming feedback guitar. Ken Kesey had first encountered psychedelics as a paid volunteer in a government-sponsored study at the Menlo Park VA Hospital in 1959, one of the many legitimate early research programs. The experience cracked him open. He began writing furiously and produced One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1962, a book that could only have been written by someone who had stared directly into the machinery of institutional reality and seen through it. Flushed with royalties and an almost volcanic energy, Kesey gathered around him a band of friends and outliers he called the Merry Pranksters. In the summer of 1964, they loaded onto a school bus, painted in day-glow colors, fitted with cameras and microphones, bearing the destination sign, Further, and drove across America, filming everything, dosing freely on LSD, performing spontaneous public events they called happenings, and generally behaving as though reality were a canvas and they had just been handed an unlimited supply of very unusual paint. The pranksters' chief chemist, and the man who would define the aesthetic and quality of 1960s LSD, was Owsley Stanley, Bear, a self-taught chemistry prodigy who produced LSD of legendary purity and potency by the millions of doses, distributing much of it freely. Owsley essentially supplied the counterculture. He also served as the sound engineer for the Grateful Dead, who became the house band of the psychedelic revolution. In 1965-66, Kesey and the Pranksters staged a series of massive events in the San Francisco Bay Area. They called the acid tests, warehouse parties with the dead, playing improvised, sprawling music, strobes, fog machines, projected films, and Kool-Aid spiked with LSD available to whoever chose to drink it. These events were the prototype of the modern rave, the rock festival, and arguably the entire concept of immersive experience culture. The journalist Tom Wolfe embedded himself with Kesey and the Pranksters and reported back in his 1968 masterpiece, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, one of the defining documents of the 1960s, written in a style as hallucinatory and kinetic as its subject matter. Wolfe captured something that mere journalism couldn't: the sensation of a group of human beings collectively deciding that consensus reality was optional. The acid tests led directly to the Summer of Love in San Francisco in 1967. 100,000 young people descending on Haight-Ashbury, flowers in their hair, LSD in their bloodstream, the air thick with incense and idealism. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it seemed possible that the world might actually change. Part 7. The Parting of Ways. Leary and Alpert, for all their shared origins, were always fundamentally different people, and LSD would reveal that difference completely. Leary doubled down on spectacle. He thrived on confrontation, enjoyed his celebrity, and seemed to relish his role as public provocateur. When the Nixon administration declared him the most dangerous man in America, he practically glowed. He ran for governor of California in 1969, with John Lennon and Yoko Ono as his campaign strategists, and his campaign song Come Together, written by Lennon. He was eventually imprisoned on drug charges, escaped from minimum security prison with the help of the Weather Underground, fled to Algeria and then Switzerland, was recaptured in Afghanistan in 1973, and spent years in prison before being released in 1976. He died in 1996, managing even his own dying theatrically, webcasting it, joking that death was the ultimate trip. Richard Alpert took an entirely different road. In 1967, increasingly dissatisfied with the psychedelic scene, the hype, the commercialization, the casualties, Alpert traveled to India. He was searching for something the acid had pointed toward, but never quite delivered. A permanent transformation rather than a temporary one. In a small village in the Himalayas, he met a Hindu guru named Neem Karoli Baba, whom his followers called Maharaj Ji. The story Alpert told of their first meeting is extraordinary. Maharaj Ji, apparently without any prior knowledge of Alpert or psychedelics, described Alpert's thoughts from the previous night in precise detail, then took a massive dose of LSD Alpert offered him, 3 times a normal dose, and appeared to feel absolutely nothing. He sat and smiled. Alpert was finished chasing the molecule. He had found the source. He stayed in India, studied, meditated, and was given a new name by Maharaj Ji, Ram Das, Servant of God. He returned to America in 1971 and published Be Here Now, a book about his transformation, printed on brown paper in a hand-lettered, illustrated format that looked nothing like any book published before it. It became one of the best-selling spiritual books of the 20th century and essentially introduced a generation of Westerners to Hindu philosophy and mindfulness practice. Ram Dass spent the rest of his life as a teacher, a presence of profound warmth and gentleness. He suffered a major stroke in 1997 that left him partially paralyzed and using a wheelchair, but characteristically reframed it as fierce grace, a teaching delivered in a language beyond words. He died in 2019 at 88 on Maui, Hawaii, surrounded by students and loved ones, widely regarded as one of the most genuine and beloved spiritual teachers of his era. 2 men who took the same molecule. It sent them to completely different destinations. Part 8. Darkness and Crackdown. The counterculture's euphoria was not infinite. LSD was scheduled as a Schedule I controlled substance in the United States in 1968, effectively ending most legitimate research. The classification meant the government deemed it to have no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse, a determination that many researchers then and since have considered a political rather than scientific judgment. The summer of Manson's murders in 1969, though LSD's role in those events is debated and complicated, gave critics all the ammunition they needed. The casualties were real. Bad trips became horror stories. Psychosis in vulnerable individuals occurred, though researchers would later note that stable individuals with proper set and setting had overwhelmingly positive outcomes, and that the unsupervised massive use by millions of unprepared young people was a predictable recipe for some disasters. The Haight-Ashbury dream curdled quickly. By 1968, the neighborhood was overrun with runaways, predators, bad drugs, and despair. The Grateful Dead eventually moved away. The pranksters scattered. Kesey retreated to a farm in Oregon and spent the rest of his life writing, farming, and raising his family. He died in 2001. Underground chemists continued producing LSD through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, but in diminishing quantities and increasingly variable quality. The arrest of William Leonard Pickard in 2000, believed to be responsible for producing the majority of the world's LSD supply at the time, in a missile silo in Kansas, was said to have caused a global shortage lasting years. Part 9. The Quiet Renaissance. Then, quietly, something shifted. Beginning in the early 2000s and accelerating through the 2010s, a new generation of researchers, armed with better neuroimaging technology, cleaner study designs, and the benefit of decades of hindsight, began making the case that the scheduling of LSD and other psychedelics had been a catastrophic mistake for medicine. Researchers at Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College London, and other institutions began publishing results that were, by the staid standards of psychiatry, remarkable. Psilocybin showed dramatic results in treating treatment-resistant depression. MDMA proved extraordinarily promising for PTSD, and LSD itself re-entered clinical trials for anxiety, addiction, and cluster headaches, a condition sufferers sometimes call suicide headaches, for which LSD had been used underground for decades as a remarkably effective treatment. The concept of microdosing, taking sub-perceptual doses of LSD, around 10 micrograms, too small to hallucinate but pharmacologically active, spread from Silicon Valley into mainstream culture, with practitioners claiming improvements in creativity, focus, and emotional regulation. The science on microdosing is still mixed, with rigorous trials producing more modest results than the enthusiasm suggested. But the cultural conversation had permanently shifted. In 2023, Australia became the first country to authorize the prescription of MDMA and psilocybin for therapeutic use. Several American states moved toward decriminalization. The FDA granted psychedelic-assisted therapy breakthrough therapy designations. Hoffman himself, in old age, watching the Renaissance from his house in Switzerland, was quietly satisfied. He had always maintained that his molecule was not a drug of abuse but a tool, that it demanded respect, intention, and the right conditions. He had always believed that if civilization was to survive its own crises, it would need tools that could help human beings experience directly their unity with each other and with the natural world. Epilogue. The molecule endures. LSD-25 is still, 8 decades after that bicycle ride in Basel, one of the most mysterious and debated objects in all of pharmacology. It weighs a fraction of nothing. It fits inside a receptor like a key inside a lock. It persists in that lock, patient as a saint, for hours. And in those hours, the human brain, that magnificent overgrown tangle of 100 billion neurons, somehow becomes briefly transparent to itself. Whether that transparency is a glitch or a feature of consciousness, whether it reveals truth or manufactures beautiful lies, whether it is a medicine or a menace or a sacrament, that argument continues, as fiercely as ever. What is not in dispute is this: a single Swiss chemist, on an afternoon in 1943, bicycled home through the dissolving Swiss countryside with a molecule clinging to his fingertips, and the world that emerged on the other side of that afternoon was never quite the same world again. Turn on, tune in, be here now. Further. Sources draw on the documented history of psychopharmacology, the Harvard Psilocybin Project, FDA and DEA scheduling history, Albert Hoffman's memoir Problem Child, Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, and Ram Dass's Be Here Now and subsequent interviews.